The street was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes even the sound of car tires on asphalt carry farther than usual. A black woman sat inside her parked car, the engine off, the windows slightly lowered. She wasn't causing a scene. She wasn't blasting music. She was simply waiting for her son, who was at a birthday party in one of the houses nearby. But across the road, eyes narrowed. A white woman had been watching, her phone pressed tightly in her hand. The tattoos on the mother's arms were enough for suspicion to take root in her mind. She dialed 3 numbers. Her voice, steady but charged with false alarm, carried through the dispatcher's line. "There's a dangerous-looking woman sitting in a car on my street, covered in tattoos. She doesn't belong here." Within minutes, the stillness of the neighborhood broke. Sirens wailed in the distance, drawing closer, until the flash of red and blue filled the windows of nearby houses. The black mother looked up, confusion flashing across her face as the cruisers rolled to a stop right behind her. Doors slammed shut. Officers stepped out, hands hovering near their belts, as if the woman inside the car had already committed a crime. Her heart pounded. She kept both hands visible on the steering wheel, steady breaths in and out, doing everything she had been taught to do when authority arrived uninvited. She hadn't broken a single law. All she had done was wait for her child. Yet, somehow, she had become a target. From across the street, the woman who called stood smugly on her porch, phone still recording, ready to prove to her neighbors that she had protected them. Her arms crossed with self-importance as she filmed the unfolding scene, unaware of the storm of truth and regret that was already set in motion. The officers moved closer, their steps sharp and deliberate. Each second stretched longer than the one before it. The mother didn't move, didn't flinch. Every nerve in her body told her to stay still. One wrong gesture could cost her everything. The flashing lights bounced off the windshield, turning her reflection into a fractured blur. For 3 hours, what happened on that street would not only strip away the mask of false concern, but also expose how quickly prejudice could destroy reputations, tear open wounds, and leave scars that linger far longer than the moment itself. This was not just about a phone call. It was about what happens when fear and bias collide, when perception turns into accusation, and when silence can no longer shield the truth. Before we continue with this story, take a moment to subscribe to Echoes of Hope Stories HQ so you never miss stories that matter. And tell us in the comments which country you're watching from. I'd love to know how far these stories travel. Back inside the car, the mother's chest tightened as the officers split to either side of her vehicle. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains, some whispering, others pulling out their phones to record. A child's laughter from the birthday party drifted through the air, a cruel reminder that this was supposed to be a normal afternoon. Instead, she sat there surrounded, accused, and silently fighting to maintain her dignity. One officer tapped on her window with the edge of his flashlight. The other rested his hand on the grip of his holster, eyes locked on her like she was already guilty. And then, without a single word exchanged yet, he motioned for her to roll the window down. Her hand trembled slightly as it reached toward the button. The street grew even quieter. Every eye was fixed on her. And as the glass slid lower, the officers leaned in. What came next would turn those 3 hours into the longest of her life. The moment the officer's shadows fell over her window, everything changed. Her name was Danielle Brooks, 32 years old. A single mother who had carried more than her share of weight in life, but wore it with a quiet strength most people overlooked. To the casual passerby, the first thing they saw were the tattoos decorating her arms, inked lines and shaded words that some read as rebellion. But for Danielle, each one was a piece of her story carved in permanence. On her left forearm, a folded flag with her father's initials. He had served in the military, a man of discipline who never came home from his last deployment. She had been just 16 when he passed, but the memory of him folding her into a protective hug stayed with her. That tattoo was not decoration. It was a grave marker she could carry wherever she went. On her wrist, the date her son Malik was born, etched in simple numbers. That was the day her life shifted from survival to devotion. Every hour at work, every dollar saved, every sleepless night, it all traced back to those numbers. and stretched across her shoulder, a phrase that held her steady through nights of exhaustion and days of judgment. "Still, I rise." Some dismissed it as cliché, but to Danielle, it was fuel. The ink was her shield, a reminder that she had risen from loss, from heartbreak, from systems designed to keep her down. Danielle was a nurse at the county hospital, the kind of nurse who worked extra shifts without complaint and stayed late when a patient's family couldn't make it. She had compassion that patients remembered, but outside of her scrubs, strangers too often saw only the ink and the skin it was on. Colleagues respected her work ethic, but Danielle knew the subtle looks in grocery stores, the clutch of a purse when she stepped into an elevator, the assumption that tattoos on a black woman must mean trouble. She had learned to live with it, not because it didn't sting, but because she couldn't waste her energy explaining that her skin and her choices of self-expression did not make her a threat. Her entire world was Malik. At 7 years old, he was bright-eyed, with a curiosity that left no question unasked. He loved building Lego towers, drawing superheroes, and reading adventure books at bedtime. That afternoon, he was at his friend's birthday party, running between balloons and slices of cake, while Danielle gave him space to be a child. She parked on the side of the street, close enough to keep her own sense of watchfulness, far enough not to intrude. For her, waiting in the car was routine. For the neighbor across the street, it became grounds for suspicion. Danielle's motherhood had always required double the effort. Like so many black mothers in America, she raised her son not just with love and guidance, but also with lessons of survival. Lessons about how to carry himself so that others would not mistake innocence for danger. She had already told him at just 7 to keep his hands visible when talking to adults, to answer questions politely, and never ever to argue if someone in authority told him what to do. The double burden was this: she had to be both nurturing and defensive, both gentle and alert. She had to raise Malik to dream while also preparing him to defend his very right to exist without suspicion. As she sat in her car that afternoon, she scrolled through her phone, half reading, half watching the door, for the moment Malik would burst out with frosting on his cheeks and stories of the party. She wasn't bothering anyone. She wasn't trespassing. But still, eyes from across the street narrowed in judgment, convinced that a woman with tattoos and brown skin, waiting in a parked car, must mean danger. Danielle had lived long enough to recognize when someone was staring. She noticed the figure on the porch, the phone raised, the whispers turning into a call. Her stomach sank, not because she had done anything wrong, but because she knew what judgment carried in this country. For Danielle, prejudice wasn't theoretical. It was everyday life. Coded words from supervisors, neighbors questioning if she really lived in her own apartment complex, people assuming the worst simply because they couldn't separate her appearance from their fear. Her father had warned her about this before he died. "Baby, some people will decide who you are before you even open your mouth. Never let them be right." Those words had lived in her chest ever since. But sitting in her car now, with a stranger reporting her as a threat, she wondered how many times she would have to prove her humanity. Inside the birthday party, Malik laughed with his friends. Outside, his mother sat under the weight of suspicion, not yet knowing that the sirens were already on their way, summoned by fear, bias, and the arrogance of one woman who believed her presence didn't belong. The flashing lights had not yet arrived, but the call had been made, and Danielle's quiet watch over her son was about to be turned into a public trial she never asked for. And when the cruisers did finally appear, they would not approach her as a nurse or a mother or a woman waiting patiently for her child. They would approach her as a suspect. Across the street from a 2-story home with manicured hedges and a porch swing that barely moved in the light breeze, Linda Crawford watched with fixed attention. 53, well off, a face polished with the kind of self-assurance that came from years of unchallenged authority in her community. Her life was a routine of brunches, charity luncheons, and book clubs where the talk was more gossip than literature. But today, her attention wasn't on her roses or her mail. It was locked on the black woman sitting quietly in the car outside. Danielle Brooks. A stranger in her eyes, though Danielle had been to that street before. Linda narrowed her gaze at the tattoos inked on Danielle's skin. To her, the art wasn't history, or love, or resilience. To Linda, it was dangerous. She muttered to herself as she reached for her phone. Not here. Not in this neighborhood. Her fingers moved quickly over the screen, dialing 911. When the dispatcher answered, Linda's tone was polite, almost casual, yet heavy with the weight of accusation. "Yes, hello," she began. "There's a suspicious woman parked on my street. She's just sitting there in her car and hasn't moved for a while. Covered in tattoos, looks dangerous." The dispatcher asked for clarification. Linda pressed on, her words shaping a narrative far from the truth. "She doesn't live here. I know all my neighbors, and I've never seen her before. She's staring at the houses like she's waiting for something. I'm worried she might be on drugs or planning something criminal." The dispatcher's voice was calm, noting down the information, promising that a unit would check it out. Linda hung up with a sense of satisfaction, folding her arms and watching Danielle as if she'd done her civic duty. What she didn't realize, or didn't care to realize, was that the ink on Danielle's arms wasn't danger written in black and gray. It was the folded flag of a father who gave his life in service. It was the birth date of a son she adored. It was a phrase that had carried her through struggle. "Still I rise." Every tattoo was a page of a story Linda had no interest in reading. She saw only what her prejudice allowed. Inside her home, Linda's husband was half watching television, unaware of the storm his wife had just set in motion. She didn't tell him she'd called the police. She didn't need to. To her, this was routine, seeing something she didn't like, labeling it suspicious, and letting the system handle it. But the system didn't just handle things, it magnified them. Linda's phone call was no small gesture. It carried weight, and that weight would come crashing down on Danielle in minutes. Linda leaned against the porch railing, phone still in hand. She adjusted the camera app, angling it to record discreetly. She whispered, almost proud, "Now let's see what you're really doing here." She expected confirmation of her suspicions. She expected officers to arrive, uncover something, and prove her right. What she didn't expect was that her call would ignite something far larger than a routine police stop. Because once her accusations were written into the system, Danielle was no longer a mother waiting for her son. She had been recast as a criminal before the first siren even wailed. The dispatcher's report had already coded Danielle as suspicious individual, possible drug activity, vehicle stationary, caller concerned. Those words, sterile on a screen, were enough to shape how the arriving officers would see her. Linda sipped from her glass of iced tea, gaze steady, satisfied. What she didn't know was that her concern would be broadcast to thousands once Danielle's phone went live. What she didn't know was that every judgment she made in those few minutes would come back not as confirmation, but as condemnation. The quiet on the street shifted. The faint sound of sirens, distant at first, began to grow louder. Red and blue lights flickered faintly against the horizon, then grew stronger as the patrol cars closed in. Neighbors began stepping out onto porches, curious about the disturbance. Children paused mid-game to look down the street. The birthday music muffled inside one of the homes could still be heard faintly, a strange contrast to the approaching noise. Danielle sat motionless in her car, phone resting in her lap, her eyes darting toward the growing lights behind her. She knew, without question, that they were coming for her. And on the porch, Linda straightened her back, phone camera aimed, ready to capture her proof. The cruisers slowed, their engines humming low, the wail of sirens cutting abruptly as they rolled to a stop. Doors cracked open, and officers stepped out, each movement deliberate. The lights bounced across windows and windshields, illuminating Danielle's reflection in fractured beams. Linda lifted her phone higher, smug certainty curling her lips. The street had changed, and as the officers began their approach, the next 3 hours would write a story she never expected to be part of. The sound of boots on pavement grew louder. The sirens had gone silent, but the storm they carried had just arrived. The shrill sirens faded as the police cruisers pulled to a stop, but the flash of red and blue lights painted the street in restless color. Engines idled low, their vibrations filling the air. Neighbors peered through curtains, some stepping onto porches, drawn by the spectacle of flashing lights outside their homes. Danielle's chest tightened. She placed both hands on the steering wheel, fingers spread wide, her breath slow and deliberate. Every lesson she had ever absorbed about surviving encounters with authority replayed in her mind. Keep your voice steady. Don't reach suddenly. Show your hands. Comply first, explain later, if you get the chance. The officers stepped out, boots pressing against pavement in sharp rhythm. Their eyes were fixed on her before a single word had been exchanged. In their expressions, she saw the verdict already written. One officer tapped a flashlight against his palm as he approached. "License and registration," he demanded. His voice was curt, void of greeting. Danielle rolled the window down carefully, every movement exaggerated so they could see her hands. "Officer, I'm just waiting for my son at a birthday party. I live." "License," he repeated, louder this time. She nodded slowly, reaching toward her purse on the passenger seat. She kept her left hand high on the steering wheel, fingers spread as her right hand moved in plain view. She pulled out her wallet, slipped her license free, and extended it through the open window. Another officer circled the car, shining his light through the back seat, peering for evidence of what Linda had claimed. His tone sharpened. "What are you doing parked here so long?" Residents called in about suspicious behavior. Danielle held her voice steady. "I told you, I'm waiting for my son. He's inside at the party." The first officer narrowed his eyes at her tattoos, lingering on the ink across her forearm. "Covered in tattoos, sitting in a parked car. We get calls like this all the time. Usually it means drugs, loitering, or worse." Her pulse raced, but her tone remained calm. "I'm a nurse. I just got off a shift. I'm tired. I'm waiting for my little boy." From across the street, Linda Crawford's phone camera caught every second. She leaned on her porch rail, a satisfied smirk across her lips. In her mind, the scene was proof that her instincts had been right, that calling the police had been the responsible thing to do. She zoomed in on Danielle's face, on the officers circling the vehicle, eager to post the footage later as validation of her concerns. Danielle's eyes flicked to the porch, catching sight of Linda's raised phone. Anger simmered beneath her composure, but she pressed it down. This wasn't the time. Not with two officers surrounding her, their hands never straying far from their belts. "Step out of the car, ma'am," one officer said suddenly. Her breath hitched. She froze, hands still visible on the wheel. "Officer, I haven't done anything. Why do I need to?" "Step out," he cut her off, his voice sharp. The sound of children's laughter from the party drifted into the heavy air. Inside, Malik was still blissfully unaware, playing with balloons and cake while his mother sat boxed in, her dignity already on trial. Danielle exhaled slowly, steadying herself. Every instinct screamed at her to protest, to demand her right to remain seated in her own car. But she remembered her father's words, "Never let them decide you're resisting." Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for the door handle. Across the street, Linda adjusted her grip on the phone, recording every movement. Her smirk widened, convinced she was watching proof of a threat being neutralized. But what she didn't know was that the moment Danielle's foot touched the ground, everything she thought she understood about control, about suspicion, about truth, was about to unravel in ways she could never have imagined. The officer stepped back, hand resting on his holster. Danielle opened the door, and with that single motion, the night's tension deepened. The evening air felt heavier the moment Danielle stepped out of her car. The officers positioned her near the hood, one standing close, the other circling as if guarding against a threat. Hands rested loosely near weapons, not drawn, but close enough to remind everyone who held the power. "Keep your hands where we can see them," the first officer said. His voice carried across the street, loud enough for neighbors to hear. Curtains twitched, porch lights flicked on. The street that had been silent minutes earlier was now an impromptu stage, and Danielle had been cast in the role of suspect. She stood tall, hands at her sides, jaw tight. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't resisted. But still, she could feel the weight of eyes pressing down on her, stripping away dignity with every second she remained on display. From across the road, Linda Crawford's camera stayed fixed, her smug expression betraying no shame. She whispered into her recording, "See, I knew it. Something's not right." To her, the flashing lights were confirmation, not intrusion. Inside the birthday house, Malik had been laughing just moments earlier, his face sticky with frosting, his hands clutching party favors. But children sense more than adults think. Through the window, he caught a glimpse of flashing red and blue. The laughter around him faded into background noise. His small frame darted past balloons, past startled parents, through the front door and onto the lawn. "Mom," he cried, his voice breaking into a sob as he spotted her surrounded by uniforms. He sprinted across the grass, tears streaming before he even reached her. Danielle's heart clenched. She shifted her eyes toward him, though she didn't dare move her arms. "It's okay, baby," she said softly, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "Go back inside. Mommy's fine." But he didn't believe her. Malik wrapped himself around her leg, clinging tightly, his small shoulders shaking. To him, the sight was unmistakable. His mother being treated like someone dangerous, when all she had done was love him enough to wait outside. The second officer frowned. "Ma'am, get the kid out of here." Her voice sharpened just slightly. "He's 7 years old. You frightened him. Let him stay close." The officer muttered something under his breath but turned away, focusing instead on the car. Flashlight beams cut through the windows, scanning empty seats, a clean floorboard, a purse in plain view. Nothing. Another officer, now joined from a second patrol car, opened the driver's side door and leaned inside. He rifled through the glove compartment, the side pockets, the center console. A growing audience of neighbors murmured, some whispering, others holding up their phones. The sound of recording clicks punctuated the night. Linda zoomed in, her lips curling. "They'll find something," she muttered to herself. But the search revealed nothing. No drugs, no weapons, no reason for suspicion, other than a neighbor's prejudice. The officer shut the door harder than necessary, his frustration evident. "Clear," he called out to his partner. Danielle remained silent, her face calm, her posture unshaken. Inside, her stomach churned, but she refused to let them see her break. She had worked too hard, sacrificed too much, to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her crumble under false suspicion. Malik sniffled into her leg, his small hands gripping her tightly. For a child, the scene was a lesson no mother ever wants to teach, that innocence can still be shackled by perception, and dignity can be stolen without reason. For him, this memory would outlast the cake, the balloons, the laughter inside the house. He would always remember the flashing lights against his mother's skin, the officers circling her like she was dangerous, and the helplessness of not being able to protect her. And for Danielle, the scars of this night wouldn't be the bruises or the humiliation in front of strangers. It would be knowing that her son's childhood had been branded with the image of his mother, treated like a criminal for simply waiting for him. The officers regrouped near their cars. One of them rubbed the back of his neck, glancing briefly at Danielle before lowering his voice. "We didn't find anything," his partner said. "Yeah," the first officer replied, his tone dismissive. "But we got a call. We had to respond." The words cut through the night like another accusation. A call was all it took to strip a mother of her peace, to frighten a child, to turn a quiet evening into a stage of humiliation. Danielle didn't respond. She simply stood there, her son clutching her leg, her silence louder than anything she could have spoken. The night wasn't over. The officer's words, "We got a call. We had to respond," hung in the air like smoke. Danielle knew what it meant. No apology, no acknowledgement, just the casual shrug of authority that left scars deeper than they understood. She took a slow breath, eyes narrowing just enough to mask the storm behind them. Then, her voice broke the silence, measured, calm, deliberate. "Officer, may I have your badge number?" The man blinked at her, caught off guard. He wasn't used to questions framed with composure. "Why do you need that?" "Because you've detained me, searched my car, and humiliated me in front of my son," Danielle replied. "I'd like to record who was involved." She shifted her stance slightly, lowering her voice so Malik wouldn't hear the tremor at the edges. With one hand still resting protectively on his shoulder, she reached into her purse and retrieved her phone. The glow of the screen lit her face as she pressed a button and, with a steady thumb, went live. "Good evening," Danielle said, her voice calm but edged with resolve. "My name is Danielle Brooks. I'm a nurse, a mother, and right now I'm standing outside my car while police search it because a neighbor decided I looked suspicious." The feed opened instantly. Sep. Within seconds, comments rolled across her screen. Stay strong, sis. This is racial profiling. We see you. We've been here too. The officers shifted uncomfortably, one tugging at his vest. The second turned away, muttering under his breath. From her porch, Linda Crawford stiffened. She had been narrating her own version of the scene for her recording, but now Danielle's voice carried to an audience far larger than the neighborhood. Linda's phone lowered slightly. She hadn't anticipated this. Danielle turned the camera toward the flashing lights, the uniforms, her son clutching her leg. I've been asked to stand here while my car is searched. They've found nothing, yet I'm still being treated like I don't belong here. For those watching, I need you to see what happens when appearance alone becomes evidence. The viewer count climbed. Dozens became hundreds. The comments scrolled faster. This is exactly why we film everything. Stay calm, you're not alone. Name and shame those officers. The officer who had first demanded her license stiffened when she pointed her phone in his direction. Turn that off, he barked. Danielle kept her voice calm. No, sir. I have every right to record this interaction. The live stream caught his scowl, the tension in his jaw. Across the street, Linda's smugness faltered. Her recording suddenly seemed small, powerless compared to the flood of eyes pouring into Danielle's feed. She bit her lip, realizing the story she wanted to spin, that she had protected her street, was already slipping away. The neighborhood had become a stage, but now the script was changing. Danielle was no longer just the accused. She was the narrator of her own story, and the world was listening. Her phone buzzed as texts came in from friends who had seen the stream. Strangers left messages of solidarity. Parents chimed in with their own stories of being stopped, searched, questioned. Malik looked up at her, still frightened but slightly calmer, sensing his mother's steady tone. Danielle bent her knees slightly so he could hear her whisper, "You're safe, baby? Just hold on." The officer shifted again, clearly irritated that his authority was being questioned publicly. "This doesn't need to get out of hand," he muttered. "It already has," Danielle said softly, though the words carried power. The viewer count doubled again. Hashtags formed in the comments, names demanded, calls for accountability ringing louder than the wail of any siren. Linda's phone shook in her hand now, no longer steady, her confidence eroding as she realized how quickly control had flipped. She had wanted proof of danger, but instead she had become the spark for a firestorm. Danielle raised her phone higher, her voice unwavering. To anyone watching, this is what happens when being a mother waiting for her child is mistaken for being a criminal. This is what bias looks like when it wears the mask of safety. The crowd of neighbors had grown. Some watched silently, unsure, but a few whispered among themselves, their expressions shifting from suspicion to unease. The scene no longer looked like protection, it looked like harassment. And then, just as the tension seemed to thicken beyond breaking, another voice entered the mix. From the corner of the street, a man carrying a camera slung over his shoulder approached briskly. His press badge glinted under the streetlights. A local journalist, alerted by the live stream, had arrived. He raised his camera, adjusting the lens, his voice steady. "Miss Brooks, I saw your feed. Would you be willing to share what's happening on record?" The officer stiffened. Linda's face paled, and Danielle, she straightened her shoulders. Before we continue, subscribe to Echoes of Hope for deeper truths. Tell me in the comments section where you're watching from. The journalist's camera clicked to life, its small red light glowing like a warning that what happened on this quiet street would no longer remain confined to whispers and porch gossip. He introduced himself quickly, then pointed his microphone toward Danielle. "Can you tell us what's happening here?" Danielle steadied her voice. She adjusted Malik on her hip. He refused to let go of her, and faced the lens head-on. "I was waiting for my son outside his friend's birthday party when police arrived. They said they got a call about a suspicious person. They searched my car. They found nothing. And yet I'm still standing here, treated like I don't belong." The feed streamed live, not just to her phone anymore, but now through the journalist's professional equipment. Within minutes, local newsrooms picked it up, broadcasting across evening segments. Clips were played on social media. Hashtags swelled in number, demanding accountability. The officers shifted uneasily. Their earlier confidence had eroded under the glare of lights and public attention. One officer tugged at his collar. Another muttered to the journalist, "We're just responding to a call. That's our job." But the lens caught the stiffness in his body language, the unease that came from being recorded while trying to justify an act that had no justification. Across the street, Linda Crawford finally lowered her phone. She cleared her throat loudly, stepping off her porch as if she could reclaim the narrative with sheer audacity. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice firm. "I was protecting the neighborhood. I didn't recognize her. I was just trying to keep us safe." The journalist turned toward her, microphone raised. "Are you the one who made the call?" "Yes," Linda admitted without hesitation. "And I'd do it again. You never know what people are doing in cars around here. Better safe than sorry." The crowd of neighbors murmured. Some frowned, others folded their arms, uncomfortable at hearing her words laid bare. For the first time, Linda looked less like a concerned neighbor and more like the source of an unnecessary crisis. The journalist pivoted smoothly back to Danielle. "Do you live in this area?" Danielle nodded. "Yes, I've been here before. My son goes to school with the family hosting this party. I was sitting in my car, waiting for him, like any parent would. That's all." The camera panned briefly toward the birthday house. A mother stepped onto the lawn, holding a plate of cake still in her hand. Her voice shook with anger. "She's telling the truth. Malik is inside playing with my son. Danielle has done nothing wrong." Another neighbor, who had been silent until then, added, "I've seen her here before. She's always respectful. She never causes trouble. She was just waiting quietly." The witnesses' voices carried more weight than Linda's defensive protests. The journalist pressed further, asking Danielle, "What do you want people to understand about what happened tonight?" Danielle met the camera's gaze, her shoulders squared, her voice steady despite the exhaustion in her eyes. "That this is what racial profiling looks like. Tattoos on my arms don't make me a criminal. The color of my skin doesn't make me a threat. But because someone decided I didn't belong, I had to explain my existence to police officers in front of my son." The journalist nodded, visibly moved. Behind him, Linda tried again to inject herself. "I didn't mean for this to blow up. I just thought." But the camera didn't linger on her this time. Her voice faded into the background, drowned out by the growing power of Danielle's calm testimony. For the next hour, clips spread like wildfire. Local news stations pushed alerts. National outlets picked up the hashtags. Strangers commented online, "This could have been me. She handled this with more grace than I ever could. Her son will never forget this night." Maya's framing voice cut through the growing noise. In just 3 hours, Linda Crawford went from self-proclaimed protector to exposed instigator of racial profiling. Her attempt to paint suspicion had turned into a mirror reflecting her own prejudice back to the world. The police, now visibly uncomfortable, huddled near their cars. The officers avoided eye contact with the journalist, their earlier authority slipping through their fingers. They knew the story was no longer theirs to control. Danielle lowered Malik gently to the ground. He clung to her hand, wide-eyed but calmer now, sensing that the tide was shifting. She bent low, whispering reassurance. "We're okay. Mommy's okay." The crowd had grown larger. Neighbors who had doubted now whispered apologies. Parents from the party gathered closer, some offering supportive touches on Danielle's shoulder. The scene had transformed. From humiliation to exposure, from isolation to solidarity. Then, just as Danielle's phone buzzed again with hundreds of notifications from her live stream, a single call cut through the noise. She glanced at the screen. The name made her blink twice, her breath catching in her throat. It wasn't a friend or coworker. It wasn't a random number. It was someone she never expected to hear from at that moment. She pressed the phone to her ear, her voice low. "Hello?" The next words made her eyes widen. Danielle's hand trembled slightly as she lifted the phone to her ear. On the other end was a voice she recognized instantly, her supervisor at the hospital. "Danielle," the voice said firmly, "we saw the live stream. The staff are all talking about it. We want you to know you have our full support. Whatever you need, whatever they say, you're not standing alone." Her throat tightened, relief mixing with exhaustion. For years she had poured herself into her job, working double shifts, covering holidays, serving patients with compassion, even when her own life felt stretched thin. And now, in the middle of a public humiliation, her workplace was standing behind her. The call didn't end there. Minutes later, as news crews scrambled to set up more equipment and neighbors whispered about the growing coverage, Danielle's phone buzzed again. This time it was Malik's school PTA president. "We've just released a statement," the woman said, her tone resolute. "The entire PTA stands in solidarity with you and Malik. Parents should never fear being criminalized while waiting for their children. We're demanding accountability from the department. We're also demanding that the school board address racial bias in the community." Danielle's eyes stung. She glanced down at Malik, who was still holding her hand tightly. For him, this was confusion and fear. For her, it was the rare moment where support outweighed silence. Around her, the officers shifted uneasily. Their radios crackled faintly, dispatchers reminding them to remain professional, to avoid escalation. Yet professionalism seemed hollow now, their posture betraying discomfort. The power had slipped from their hands. Across the street, Linda Crawford's certainty began to crumble. She tried again to justify herself, raising her voice louder this time. "I was only looking out for everyone. If something had happened, you'd all be thanking me." But her words no longer landed. The same neighbors who had once nodded politely at her gossip now stood stone-faced, their arms crossed. A mother shook her head in quiet disbelief. Another neighbor whispered to the journalist, "We've lived here 10 years. Danielle's been here before. She never caused trouble. Linda just didn't like the way she looked." The camera turned briefly toward Linda, capturing her pale face and trembling lip. For the first time, regret flickered in her eyes, not out of empathy, but out of fear of consequence. She had built her identity on being the protector of her neighborhood. Now she was exposed as the instigator of racial profiling. Maya's framing voice cut in. Regret had finally begun to creep into the heart of those who thought prejudice was harmless. But regret, when born from exposure instead of conscience, comes too late. By now, Danielle's live stream had reached tens of thousands. National outlets were resharing clips. Community leaders began tagging officials. Pressure mounted on the police department. The chief's office issued a brief statement. "We are reviewing the incident to ensure proper procedures were followed." But to the public, those words sounded hollow. What they saw wasn't procedure, it was humiliation. It was the criminalization of a mother for the simple act of waiting. Danielle stood straighter, though exhaustion weighed on her bones. She hadn't asked for this stage, hadn't asked for her son to witness this moment, yet here she was, dignity intact, voice steady, refusing to shrink. Her phone buzzed once more, another unfamiliar number. She hesitated, then answered. "Miss Brooks?" the voice asked. "This is Councilwoman Reyes. I've been watching everything unfold. The City Council is meeting this week to address community safety and bias in policing. We would like you to attend and to speak. Your voice is important." Danielle blinked, caught between disbelief and resolve. She hadn't planned to be an advocate, hadn't planned to tell her story beyond surviving it. But now the opportunity was opening, and the weight of responsibility pressed against her chest. She looked at Malik, who stared back at her with wide eyes. He didn't fully understand politics, but he understood one thing. His mother was being asked to stand up not just for herself, but for others. The flashing lights had faded, the officers lingering awkwardly, unsure whether to stay or leave. Neighbors began retreating back inside, murmuring about what they had witnessed. The journalist's camera stayed fixed on Danielle, waiting for her reaction. She pressed the phone closer to her ear. "Yes," she said softly, "I'll be there." And with those words, the stage shifted yet again. The humiliation of the night was not over, but something unexpected had taken root in its place: momentum. The council chamber buzzed with quiet tension, every seat filled. Reporters lined the back walls, cameras balanced on tripods, lights aimed at the long wooden table where Danielle sat. Behind her, a large screen flickered with still frames from her live stream, the red and blue lights reflecting off her windshield. Malik clinging to her leg, officers circling her car. At the center of the dais, Councilwoman Reyes called the meeting to order. "Tonight," she said firmly, "we address what unfolded on Birchwood Lane. A call that should never have been made, a response that should never have escalated, and a humiliation that no resident should endure. Danielle adjusted the microphone, Malik's small hand tucked into hers. The chamber quieted. She began softly, her voice steady despite the weight of dozens of eyes upon her. "I am Danielle Brooks," she said. "I am a nurse. I am a mother. And on that night, I was a suspect. Not because of what I did, but because of who I am and what I look like." She paused, letting the silence hold her words. "My tattoos are not marks of danger. They are tributes. To my father, who gave his life in service. To my son, who gives my life meaning. To the words that keep me moving when the world tries to push me down. My tattoos tell my story. They don't make me dangerous." On the screen, the live stream replayed the moment officers searched her car. The sound of Malik crying filled the chamber, his small voice calling for his mother. Many in the audience shifted uncomfortably, some wiping their eyes. The council played the footage further, the officers circling, Linda's voice in the background insisting she was protecting the neighborhood. Then Danielle's calm words to the camera, "This is what bias looks like." When the video ended, silence clung to the room. Then the police chief, seated 2 rows ahead, leaned forward. His uniform seemed heavier than usual, his shoulders tight. Clearing his throat, he addressed the chamber. "Our department mishandled this," he admitted, his voice stiff. "We should have approached differently. We should have de-escalated. For that, we apologize to Ms. Brooks and her son." The words were careful, but they marked something rare, an acknowledgement of wrongdoing in a space where denial often reigned. Councilwoman Reyes turned toward Linda Crawford, seated reluctantly in the second row. "Mrs. Crawford, do you wish to speak?" Linda rose slowly, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. Her voice cracked. "I never meant for it to go this far. I was scared. I thought I was protecting my neighbors. I see now that I was wrong." But the audience didn't soften. Murmurs spread, some shaking their heads. One neighbor stood and said aloud, "You weren't protecting us. You were profiling her." Applause rippled, short but firm, underlining that Linda's excuses fell flat. Linda's tears fell harder, but the chamber didn't bend to them. For once, her performance of concern found no audience willing to believe it. Danielle drew in a breath, leaned toward the microphone again, and lifted her chin. "The harm isn't undone by an apology. My son will carry this memory with him. He will remember the night he saw his mother treated like a criminal for waiting in a car. That's not something you erase with words." The chamber fell silent again before breaking into applause, sustained, powerful, echoing through the wooden walls. Danielle didn't raise her hands or smile. She simply nodded, her eyes damp, but her posture unbroken. Councilwoman Reyes concluded the testimony. "Let the record show that what happened to Ms. Brooks is unacceptable. Our city cannot claim to be safe while suspicion and bias dictate who belongs." As the meeting adjourned, reporters surged forward, eager for sound bites. Cameras flashed. Malik clung to his mother's arm, and she bent to whisper reassurance in his ear. In the back of the room, Linda sank into her chair, head bowed, tissue crushed in her palm. Danielle Brooks was humiliated for 3 hours. 3 hours of flashing lights, harsh voices, and the cold weight of suspicion that never should have touched her in the first place. But what happened in those hours did not end with shame. It ended with strength. It ended with truth. And it transformed a single mother waiting for her son into a voice the city and the nation could not ignore. Her tattoos were once reduced to stereotypes. To some, they were marks of rebellion, signals of danger. Yet Danielle made the world see them differently. A folded flag etched into her arm carried the memory of her father, who gave his life in uniform. A string of numbers on her wrist marked the day Malik was born, the day her fight for survival became a fight for love. A phrase across her shoulder declared her resilience. "Still I rise." She had been forced to defend the simple act of waiting for her child. But in doing so, she revealed something far greater, the way racism lingers not just in grand gestures of hate, but in everyday neighborhoods, in the smallest decisions of who is trusted and who is feared. This is how prejudice survives, in the sideways glances, in the calls made out of concern, in the assumptions that tell a mother she does not belong where she is. Danielle's story was extraordinary because it was exposed, live-streamed, amplified to tens of thousands. But how many others have gone unseen, unrecorded, dismissed as routine? Systemic racism isn't always loud. Sometimes it whispers through the cracks of daily life. Sometimes it dresses itself as safety or protection. Sometimes it looks like a neighbor dialing 911 and believing they've done something noble. And too often, it leaves mothers like Danielle explaining their existence in front of their children. Think about it. Have you ever been judged for how you look? Have you ever been told, through words, through stares, through silence, that you didn't belong? And if you had been there that night, standing on the sidewalk while police circled her, would you have spoken up? Would you have stood beside her when she asked for badge numbers, when she lifted her phone and live-streamed her truth? Or would you have stayed behind the curtain, whispering but never acting? These are not questions meant to wound. They are questions meant to awaken, because stories like Danielle's don't exist in isolation. They ripple outward. They call each of us to examine how we respond when injustice unfolds in front of us. The night on Birchwood Lane did not break Danielle Brooks. It showed the city what resilience looks like. It showed her son Malik that dignity can be louder than humiliation. And it showed the world that even in the most ordinary of settings, a birthday party, a parked car, a quiet street, bias can creep in and ignite something far larger than intended. But here's the truth. Humiliation doesn't get the final word. Courage does. And tonight, Danielle's courage has become more than her own. It belongs to every mother who has sat in a car and felt watched, to every parent who has taught their child to keep their hands visible, to every person who has been asked to prove their innocence when they never committed a crime. So I turn this story to you. Have you ever faced something like this? Have you ever witnessed prejudice in your own neighborhood, at work, or on the street? Share your story in the comments. Let others know they are not alone. And if you believe no mother should face humiliation in front of her child, no parent should be criminalized for waiting, resting, existing, then subscribe to Echoes of Hope Stories HQ. This is where voices like Danielle's will never be silenced, where their dignity will always be amplified. Because prejudice may call the cops, but truth, dignity, and courage, they always answer louder.